So, thank you very much for that nice introduction. The work that I tell you about, our research work, is actually, it's not just me, it's in collaboration with lots of people, some of them listed here. There's a variety of disciplines, so humanities, digital humanities, medieval history, and all sorts of expertise combined together to produce this. But first, since the talk ends with the statue, and the statue is to do with the identity of Athlone, I start with the question of identity, and what's my identity? I'm partly motivated by this because one of the comments on Athlone down memory lane was, why would Athlone Council respond to somebody living in England, naming myself? So I want to nail that in the head from the start. That's my dad's pub, that was mentioned before. Many of you will recognise the Ossian bar. There's my dad in the Palace bar, where he spied this beautiful woman as she was crossing the bridge, and that ended up in me, and my sister and my brother, and so on. So there's my mum, Irene, on the banks of the Shannon. We go back further, there's my granddad, Peter Benson, back in Coosan, there just around the start of the last century, and the other side of the family, the Kennas, come from the Kiltoon for a very long time. So we've been around here a long time, so we can dismiss any... Firstly, I would say, by the way, that the points I'm going to make should be independent of where I come from. I mean, I'm making the points just for the point's sake, but as it happens, I am from Athlone. Why was I not aware? You might be aware that I was not aware of this process in the beginning about the statue in Athlone, and that's something that I've been sort of chastised about even today. Today we met the council, and I was, let's say, reprimanded for not knowing about this in the first place. Well, and indeed there was a letter to the Westmeath 2 weeks ago. If people weren't stuck in their ivory towers, they would be aware of this process. That people is me. I'm not always in the ivory towers, but anyway. Then the council themselves said it's a shame this feedback didn't happen at the time when public consultation was taking place, which to me indicates that if it had happened, they might have done something different. Anyway, the nature of science is it's very international. All the expertise is not in one place. So this is where I travel to, or I interact with these people a lot. These are the people who I collaborate with scientifically mostly, or they come to Coventry or I go there. So last week or 2 weeks ago I was in Armenia, for example, and people come to Coventry as well. So it's not possible simply to have all the expertise in the world right here in Athlone. And so people, and it's not possible to have it in Coventry either. So I go from Coventry to somewhere else where there is an expert I can speak to, and that's collaboration in the good sense of the word. This is Clonmacnoise. You'll recognise this as being Clonmacnoise, and we're all very proud of the history of Clonmacnoise. People came from all over the world to Clonmacnoise in the distant past, precisely to learn the expertise that people had here in Athlone. Right, so that means that's why I wasn't aware of this call. I was out and about doing science and doing stuff, and I had to monitor everything. But anyway, the next question about identity is, who are you? Are you this or are you this? Because the right picture here is to represent the new statue that's going up in Athlone at the end of this year. It's supposed to be the river god of the Shannon, and it harks back to Irish mythology as it was reported back in May in the Westmeath. I think that was the item in the Westmeath, which the one that I did pick up on and triggered my interest, caused me to write a letter to the Westmeath and kick this whole thing off. I was outraged because on the left picture is a representation, it's just a random book that I just picked, of our actual authentic mythology. You all of course know the Salmon of Knowledge, the Children of Ler, Fionn McCool, the Fianna, the Satanta, Cuchulainn, all these sorts of things, Chinanog. These are the stories that we grow up with and they sort of unify us in some way. We know we're all familiar with these things. So the question is, who are you? Are you this or are you this? What is the best identifier for yourselves? Then the question of mythology, why is it important at all? This guy, I think Ian mentioned this book that we wrote some time ago, short few years ago, Maths Meets Myths, Quantitative Approaches to Ancient Narratives. I was the editor of this book and I contributed one chapter to the book and the introduction. But the other people who contributed to the other chapters of the book were experts from all different parts of the world. One of those experts was this guy, Professor Robin Dunbar. He's famous for the so-called Dunbar number. If you Google that, you can see lots of things about him, from Oxford. He contributed one chapter to that book. And his speciality is society, how society is formed and that sort of stuff, cohesion. He said in this book, in his chapter in our book, he wrote, storytelling has played a major role in social cohesion. A shared worldview, which we have as Athlonians, let's say, or Irish people, is important for the formation of communities. Stories are important. Shared knowledge allows us to increase the efficiency of speech, because once we understand what we're talking about, we can talk quite rapidly. I'll give you a couple of examples, well, an example of this. Maybe somebody mentioned, I think Ian mentioned Brexit. Actually, this whole entire thing about the statue in Athlone reminds me of Brexit, because it is a question of process, and process is process, this sort of thing. Anyway, you'll recognise these two characters. Boris is here coming over to visit Leo and talk about Brexit, of course, and this was back in September. And Leo said to Boris that negotiating free trade agreements is going to be a Herculean task for you. And we want to be your friend, your ally, your Athena. Now what did he's referring to mythology there, of course. So what did he mean? Well, Hercules, you might remember the 12 labours of Hercules, and Hercules went mad. He actually murdered his wife and children, and he was about to kill somebody else. But Athena, who was actually the Greek goddess of wisdom, she intervened and she whacked him. She knocked him out to stop him from doing more damage. So that's what Boris is trying to. That's what Leo is trying to tell to Boris. We're going to whack you to stop you from doing too much damage. So you can see the way he's communicating through an analogy, through mythology, that they both understand and they can communicate in that way. A second example that I choose is actually also from our book. This chap is Jamie Tarani from Durham University in England, and he's talking about Little Red Riding Hood. He's done some beautiful mathematical work on Little Red Riding Hood, incredibly, and what he's done is he's looked at Little Red Riding Hood all around the world, especially Europe, but also as far as China, and where he's able to trace back the genetic structure almost. Like the story is formed, like they've kind of memes, a little bit like genes in us, and you can trace back the history of this thing in a mathematical way. Anyway, but the point is about Little Red Riding Hood, the story is not just about Little Red Riding Hood. The story is actually also a warning to not to talk to strangers, to our children. So it's for education. So this is not actually really mythology, this is more a fable, but anyway. What about our mythologies here in Ireland? Are they any good? Are they important? Do we know them? Do we care about them? Are they inferior to the classics, which Leo was using, for example, with Boris? This is my little girl, she's 5 years old, over in Rugby in England, and she's studying the Children of Learn. So should we abandon them altogether and move on and align ourselves to the classics, like this new statue that is going up in Athlone, which is sort of a classical piece, a little bit like Neptune? Should we do that? Well, whatever we think now, or whatever the council thinks now, let's go back to what people thought in the past. A few hundred years ago, there's by the way, as I say, we had this meeting today with the council. I asked them if they knew about this Annals of the Four Masters, for example. There was 4 of the 5 Athlonian councillors there. The one that was absent was his name, Boxer's son, Jamie. Yeah, he wasn't there. But so maybe Jamie might know about this, but the other 4 councillors did not know about this. The Annals of the Four Masters. It was dangerous times back in the 17th century, and in 1601, you'll remember from your history lessons the Battle of Kinsale, catastrophe for Ireland. The Irish lost due to some tactical errors, and also they had no stirrups on their horses, on the saddles of their horses, which was a catastrophic disaster. The Irish lost. It resulted in 1607 in the Flight of Earls and the end of the old Gaelic order. Then our leaders had to leave, and they went to all sorts of places. You might have heard of the word Schotten. If you're ever in Austria or Germany, I used to live in Austria. In Vienna, for example, there's a thing called the Schotten Ring in Vienna. It's like a ring road around Vienna. That Schotten Ring, the Schotten, Scottish, actually means Irish. Because back in those days, back in the olden days, the Romans referred to the Irish and the Scottish as the Scotai. We were all sort of in one. So these were actually, the Schotten cloister means a Scottish cloister, but actually it means an Irish monastery. And it's the Irish monks who went from places like Clonmacnoise to the world to spread the word. Anyway, scholars left along with the Flight of the Earls, and there was one guy that I want to talk about, Tig O'Clery. Tig was a soldier in Spain, 1621, believed to be a soldier in Spain, but he then joined the Franciscan order, became a monk, and he was asked to return to Ireland, and since he was a Franciscan, he changed his name, as they do. He changed his name from Tig to Michael, and he was asked to come back to Ireland with a specific mission, the mission being to capture Ireland's ancient manuscripts before they were destroyed by the colonisers of Ireland. And to capture our identity then, to capture our stories, our narratives and all that sort of stuff, which were under serious, serious threat, because the idea was to erase Ireland's identity and turn us into basically British. Anyway, that was the mission, and to rescue Ireland's ancient manuscripts, and this was of course very dangerous work. There's a picture of him wandering through Ireland as it was, going from big house to try and get this material as best he could. Then he led a collaboration of him and 3 other on-the-run monks. This was, by the way, just after the plantations and before Cromwell. So it was a little window of opportunity where it was less violent and less horrible, but it was still horrible. He wanted to gather manuscripts and send them to Louvain in Belgium, where they would be printed, and Ireland's heritage would be kept. That was the plan. Just to put it in context, the siege of Athlone was a little bit after that, 1691. So that was Micheál O'Clery. So he did care about our mythologies, and his people did care. He was the leader of the 4 masters who created these annals. Annals of the 4 masters, again, the council did not know this. The 4 masters actually met when they started this work in Friars Island, which you'll have heard of, I'm sure. Friars Island, right here in Athlone, as in Killinure, which is in Glasson, right down the road from where my sister lives. That's where it all started off. And so what would eventually become the Annals of 4 Masters. So here we are now, and there it is, just there. It's really just down the road, and that's what it looks like now. So it's in ruins, but it's there. Right, so he did care. Now let's go to somebody else who is not quite local, but nearly local. A guy called Richard Kerwin. He's a scientist, because maths and myths are my thing. There's Athlone, and there, just near Galway, is Clough-Ballymore, which means the town of the big stone, and that's where he was based. He was a physicist, but he also, I didn't know this until about a year ago actually. Somebody sent something to me and I investigated this guy. He's pretty much unknown anyway, anywhere nowadays, but I'm sort of bringing him back to life in some sense. He published in physics, but also incredibly in comparative mythology. When I found this out, I was delighted, because I thought I was the only one crazy enough to go from physics to comparative mythology, but this guy was well ahead of me by 250 years, and he just came from down the road, incredibly. So he was born Catholic, but after a while he wanted to continue his scientific studies and so on, so he conformed to the established religion, that being, he became Church of Ireland, Church of England, Church of Ireland. He lived 19 years in London because he wanted to interact with scientists, and they were all coming to London. He became a fellow of the Royal Society and the Royal Swedish Academy of Sciences and things like that, so quite prestigious. When he came back to Dublin, he became president of the Royal Irish Academy. But secretly he was a member of the United Irishmen and the United Irish movement, we would call it nowadays perhaps, advocating for Catholic emancipation and the overthrow of British rule in Ireland. So there's the United Irishmen doing their thing. Lord Castlereagh, I don't know if you've ever heard the name Lord Castlereagh, he's notorious. There's this poem by Shelley, I met murder on the way, he had a mask like Castlereagh, very smooth he looked, yet grim, 7 bloodhounds follow him. That wasn't about his let's say, adventures in Ireland. That was about him here in Manchester, where they massacred loads of people, basically just asking or demanding their civil rights. So he wasn't, let's say he did a lot of violent things both in Ireland and in England. Now Richard Kerwin, a little bit of physics here for this bit. This is what got me into the whole thing. Iron, you know, when you put a piece of iron to your fridge, it sticks to the fridge because it's a magnet. So a magnet is magnetized, it sticks to the fridge. But as it turns out, if you heat a piece of iron up above this temperature, 770 degrees, then it stays as a solid. It doesn't liquefy, but it becomes demagnetized. It loses its magnetic properties, and that's what's called a phase transition. It goes from being magnetized to not being magnetized. And he had the idea that maybe this magnet, this piece of iron, is made of lots of little magnets, which all have their own individual south poles and north poles, like these little fellas over here. And if the piece of iron is magnetized, then they're all pointing in the one direction, all south to north, let's say. And if they're all randomly up and down, jiggly-piggly, then the average of that is all 0, so it's not magnetized. That was his idea. And he tried to do some modelling on that, some mathematical models, but it didn't work. But it was a good idea, but it didn't work. And it didn't work because, I'll just remind this later, sorry. It didn't work because he neglected interactions. This came later, a guy called Wilhelm Lenz. He introduced the idea of interactions between these magnetons. The magnetons are actually atoms. He didn't know that then, but that's what they are. Now the first citation in the first paper about this theory, which works and is extremely important in statistical physics today, the first citation and the first thesis about this stuff is to Richard Kerwin, our guy down the road, just, I don't know, what is it, less than 100 kilometres from Athlone, just down in Galway. So this guy is pretty much unknown nowadays. I mean, Ossian is ultra famous, but the guy he cites is not. So that's one of my missions, is to get this guy sort of more known. Anyway, so there's the physics, there's the atoms, and they're all interacting with each other, just in a similar way that people interact with each other. So we are, no man is an island, no person is an island. we're a community and we all interact together, and it's crucial for our mental health and our well-being and all that sort of stuff. So nowadays what's very in vogue is sociophysics. This is where you take the ideas from physics, use the mathematics that applies to these things of atoms, and apply them to people. That's called sociophysics. It's an emergent area, and that's something that I do. But lots of people do that, not just me, sociophysics. My contribution, the novelty of our stuff, is that we don't look at actual people, but we look at people in texts, in medieval texts, ancient texts. So texts like this one is the Táin Cúailnge, the Cattle Raid of Cooley. It's an Irish text. And we've got hundreds of characters in this text. They're all interacting with each other, in the same way as the atoms are all interacting with each other. And we can do something about these things mathematically. And what we can do, for example, is compare texts, one text to another text. So we looked, for example, at the Icelandic sagas. We looked at the Greek Iliad, for example, Greek mythology, Beowulf in England, and on Táin Cúailnge in Ireland, which is the Cattle Raid of Cooley. That's the stuff that started just down the road, actually, here, when Queen Maeve set off and wanted to invade Ulster to look for a cow. There was some magical cow. All that story, that all started just down the road in Rathcroghan. So lots of incredible things happened here in Athlone, or very nearby Athlone. All that stuff is how so not just me alone, but students working with me and a team of people who became more and more interested and gathered around. And we started to look at these beautiful Irish texts. And they've got beautiful names, like, for example, the Annals of Innisfallen, for example, the Yellow Book of Lacan, the Cata, the Book of Dara, the Book of Kells, of course, you know, the Annals of Clonmacnoise. If you go down to Sean's Bar, you look at, there's a copy of it there in Sean's Bar, the Annals of Clonmacnoise, that we're so proud of. So there's our text, and we put a bit of maths on that, and we can analyse these and compare one to each other and compare them to other mythologies internationally. For this particular talk, I'm going to focus on the Fenian cycle of Irish mythology. So this is what it looks like when we start comparing them. So each little dot here, each of these four different things are four different narratives, four different big, enormous epic stories. The Táin is the Irish one, the Iliad is the Greek one, the Al Saga comes from Iceland, and that's Beowulf in England. And each of these dots are individual characters, and the little lines between them are interactions, when they're interacting with each other in the narrative. You can see we can compare one to each other. And we do that mathematically, and we can show that the Irish is as rich and as complex as anything, anywhere in the world. Okay, so that's what we did a number of years ago, and we did our first paper in this area actually was published in the Physics Journal, bizarrely. This weird mixture of maths and myths and physics and all that sort of stuff generated an enormous amount of interest, and lots of people downloaded our paper, students and people all over the place. That's our book. That booger triggered a series of books. We had conferences of people coming from all over the place. There's a physics magazine, and actually it's the main physics magazine for the UK and Ireland. And there's coverage. So the New York Times did a huge article about our work, BBC, Orff is in Austria, the Westmeath did something and covered our work. So really the council should have known because we were covered in the Westmeath. And the Irish Times and all that sort of stuff. Okay, so we had lots of coverage and made a ripple there, of course, in this bringing maths to myths. Now I tell you about cultural misappropriation. This is a work that we did 3 years ago, I think it was 2016. Yes, 3 years ago we published this paper. It's about Ossian, and I'll tell you a little bit about that. This is the team that was involved. So this chap at the top, Jose is his name. I should mention his name because he's the one who did all of the legwork really. He read the texts and did all the analysis and so on. The other guys give some expertise into the thing, and I just sort of, let's say, pull it all together. Okay, so this is the background. Am I talking too fast? No, okay. In 1746, it should take about 45 minutes to talk, by the way, so, you know, that's what I practiced with Rona last night. That's so, in case anybody's anxious. So, right, the background, in 1746 was the Battle of Culloden in Scotland. This was the final showdown between the Scottish and the English, and the Scottish lost. That was the end of Scottish independence. Scotland was absorbed into the British Empire then. Well, the end of Scottish independence, but of course now go back to Brexit, it's a little bit under discussion nowadays again. And but anyway, of course, naturally Scotland were pretty despondent after this and pretty downcast and depressed. But a few years later, not 20 years later, a guy called James Macpherson came down from the mountains in the Highlands of Scotland with what he called fragments of ancient poetry. These were translated from the original Scottish Gaelic, as they call it, Gaelic language, into English, and had a certain rhythm to them, a certain sort of a style, which was really, I can never pronounce this word. That one. Ethereal. Okay, ethereal. Like that word. That's the atmosphere that it had, like an ether, very nebulous and vague. And you know this idea you have a misty, romantic Scotland. It comes from this. So the people were delighted and they thought this is wonderful. And then he went back up the mountains again, looking for more myths. And he brought down 2 epics, published, I think, a few years apart. And people were absolutely overjoyed. This was completely new stuff that had never been seen before. The receptions were enormously positive. In literature, people like Blake, Byron, Coleridge, Goethe, and all these guys, these were motivated and started to write their own literature similar to this type of Ossianic. Ossian was claimed to be a 7th century bard, a poet from Scotland, who wrote this stuff and was transmitted orally throughout the generations until he committed it to writing or something like that. Anyway, music, Brahms, Mendelssohn, Schubert, art, people painted art around this sort of stuff. Thomas Jefferson, who you remember was a president in the United States, and he said, in America, he said Ossian was the greatest poet that ever existed. Napoleon took Ossian's poems with him on his campaigns. He was so in love with this stuff. Other nations began to look at their own literature. Previous to that, people say, for example, in Finland or other places, if they found some old book 1,000 years old, they'd say that's some rubbish old book, I'll burn it. That's what they did. Now they valued it. They thought this is really, really important, our heritage. People, the comparisons with the classics, which is the Greek and Roman stuff, the classics was immediate. This was an epic poem from Scotland. People immediately saw Homer in this, and they referred to Ossian as the Homer of the North. But not everybody was happy. In England, there was anger. In particular, Samuel Johnson was not happy. He immediately suspected a strong temptation of deceit. He viewed the Scottish as, viewed Scottish Gaelic, as they called it, as the rude speech of a barbarous people. So basically the Scottish were savage, as were the Irish, and their language was primitive. And there's no way, he said, that you could possibly have a culture like this that could pass down such a beautiful set of poetry throughout generations orally. It's not possible for such an uneducated riffraff. Now, of course, in those days, the British scholars and administrators, they aligned their attitudes much more towards the classics. They thought that the Greeks and the Romans, these were the truly civilized people, and the British had inherited this torch of civilization. So they were the ones. This justified them invading Scotland because the Scottish were barbarous savages, and the English were giving them culture. So this discovery of these poems was contrary to what the English were claiming, what the British were claiming, because this meant that Scotland had a right to exist. It is its own culture and its own mythology and its own identity. So the conflict was not just about the authenticity of the poems, but it was Scotland versus England as identity, as the right to exist. It was Romanticism versus Classicism. Classicism is the Greek stuff, Romanticism is Ossianic stuff. Nationalism, Scotland's right to exist as a nation, versus imperialism, putting them all together in the British Empire. That was the reaction in England. The reaction in Ireland was even more outraged. The Irish were absolutely furious, especially these two guys, Charles O'Connor and Sylvester O'Halloran. They immediately saw the Ossianic poems as corruptions from Irish mythology. They saw that these were basically all the characters in Ossian, the characters were Irish characters from Irish mythology that everybody knew, but they were slightly different, and everything was distorted in some weird, funny way. So, for example, Ossian, this illiterate bard of an illiterate age in Macpherson's text, was identified as Ossian, a warrior poet of Irish mythology, of the Fenian cycle of Irish mythology, who you all know Ossian. And Fingal, Ossian's father, was actually identified as Finn McCool, who had a different role in Irish mythology. They have a Cuchulainn, the general or chief of the Irish tribes in the Scottish version, was Cuchulainn, the boy hero of the Ulster cycle. It was all mixed up and all sort of weird. So the Irish said that this is a misappropriation of Ireland's Gaelic heroes for Scotland. Scotland are claiming Irish stories for their own. It was an imposture, a fake. So the question is Ossian, this stuff from Ossian, is it authentic or is it a fake? Is it stealing Irish heritage? So that's what we did. Now we weren't people have looked at this in traditional humanities ways before. We're not the first to look at this, but we look at it under this unique way, this new way of network science. And we looked at Ossian, the Iliad, because people were comparing, and the Odyssey, because people were comparing Ossian, they were trying to align Ossian with the classics. to make them more important, make them more like the Greek stuff, not like the original Irish stuff. And they were trying to distance themselves from, for example, one Irish text is Agolum Nesenioric, which means Colloquy of the Ancients, Stories of the Ancients, and a text by Lady Gregory, for example. Now this doesn't tell you anything, this is just to illustrate to you that we did a lot of work. But this one perhaps does illustrate something to you. So this is, it doesn't matter what the details are about this, it's just that we see patterns, mathematical patterns in this sort of stuff. These two plots here are comparing Ossian to the Irish and Ossian to the classics. The blue stuff is the classics, that's the Iliad and the Odyssey, and the red stuff is Ossian, the stuff from Scotland. The green stuff and the black one there are Irish. The green stuff is Irish, the original Irish thing, and again the red one is Ossian. So you can see immediately, the red one, Ossian, is like the green Irish, and it is not like the blue Greek or classics. So the bottom line of this is that Ossian is like the Irish text, and this is aligned with the view in humanities that what they claimed in the beginning, it was cultural misappropriation. So this we did 3 years ago, this sort of work, and now I come on to the Shannon and cultural misappropriation, now in the context of what's going on in Athlone now. So there's our beautiful river, our beautiful town, and here we go. So this is what was on view in early January. The public views were sought for a short period, I think it was about 2 weeks or less, something like that. Anyway, I quote now from somebody who said something in Facebook. I'll just take a random quote of many quotes. I didn't see anything about it until the decision had already been made. That's what some member of the public said. They weren't aware of this process. And a manager, let's say, from the council said, well, actually, this thing of public consultation was not part of the process from the start. This was something that they thought in the last minute, and the artists were not informed that this would go on public display. It was a last-minute decision. They brought in people, including Leaving Cert students, to have a look at it, and they were allowed to give their opinions, but it was clearly said that this public opinion will not count, because the public don't have the expertise. The experts will be in the panel, they'll decide which piece goes up. Anyway, I think the majority, despite that, people voted for each piece, but the one that received the majority of votes was this piece in the middle, this Greek-like statue. That was the one that received the majority. Now the council are saying that, well, they're going with the people. It's wrong to go back because the people voted this way. But my argument is the people had no information when they were voting on these pieces. They weren't informed about the history of these things. I was in Armenia, in Yerevan, less than 2 weeks ago, and I gave a talk about physicsy things, and I led up to this stuff. But before I told them anything, I gave them no information. I said, this is going to happen in my town. If you were given the choice, what would you say? And I give you no information. Which piece should go up as representing your town? And it was exactly the same. Some people voted that, some that, but the majority, this one received the most votes without me giving them any information. Then I told them about Ossian and all that sort of stuff, and I asked them again, and they said, aha, well, now it's a different story, and I'd like to change my mind. So no information was given. Just as evidence of that, the manager said, for example, recently, the reverse angle of the maquette may not have been easily visible. The reverse of this is the thing that's supposed to represent Athlone, because clearly this does not represent it. I mean, the front does not, certainly not represent Athlone. Anyway, that's me giving that talk in Yerevan, in Armenia, just recently. Now, if I can flick. Now, yes, I should say just about that reverse side, they will claim that the reverse side of this piece is where Athlone is the thing that's something to do with Athlone. There's some etching on the back, which I haven't seen. I don't know. Has anybody seen this thing at the back of the statue? No, nobody has seen the thing at the back. So nobody has seen the back, and that's the thing that's supposed to be specific to Athlone. And so they say that these etchings, whatever they are, these mysterious things in the back, are supposed to represent how Athlone is connected to other places around Ireland and the world and things like that. But I would say Athlone is not just important because you pass through it on the way from somewhere to somewhere else. It's also important in its own right. And I've given you some examples before, but let's give another example. I refer to this specific example because we also did a work on this, on the Viking Age in Ireland. And also using some ancient Irish text and looking at the characters and how they're interacting and so on. Just a little bit of history. In 999, Munster and Meath and Connacht defeated Leinster and Viking Dublin. Leinster and Viking Dublin were in it together, let's say. They were defeated. Brian Boru and Mael Shocknall MacDonald. Mael Shocknall was the king of Meath, and he and Brian Boru were vying for competition to become the High King of Ireland. They met here in Athlone. That's where they met. And at that meeting in Athlone, Mael Shocknall submitted to Brian. That means he agreed that Brian would be the High King. So they unified. A short while afterwards, Ulster submitted as well, and so Brian had effectively unified Ireland. So Ireland was briefly unified. Then the Leinster and the Vikings rose up in rebellion. They weren't quite happy, and they brought in Vikings from the outside, and that led to more mayhem, which ultimately led to the Battle of Clontarf. This is you'll notice two suspicious looking characters here. One is sitting here, Ewan. In the Athlone Community Radio, we were interviewed about this topic a number of years ago. And this is on national TV, where the RTE covered this on the national news, and blah, blah, blah. So it received a lot of attention. Right, now what about Ireland's rivers and the mythology around that? Well, in Irish mythology, the Shannon and the Boyne are deeply linked. Very, very closely linked in mythology. They have similar motifs. This is actually, well, let me see if I remember, yes. So Finn McCool, Ossian's father, because it's the original one, and a Salmon of Knowledge story, all that takes place in the Boyne, physically in the Boyne, the Salmon of Knowledge. So the river, the Salmon of Knowledge is a salmon, it's in a river, it associates a river with knowledge, and that's a thing in Irish mythology. Rivers are associated with knowledge. Ptolemy, you might recall, in the 2nd century, he drew the first map of Ireland. There's his map from the 2nd century AD. It's not too bad, map of Ireland, from all the way from Greece. He put out bits and pieces together. Anyway, he calls the Boyne Bovinda. The Bu means bow, which is cow, like bovine, and the Vinda comes from brightness or wisdom. So it's a cow, a wise cow somehow, is the river. The Shannon, Ptolemy called the Shannon Shanu. The original name is Shanuna, and various, but the Shan part of it might come from we know Shan means old in Irish. And the other part perhaps means goddess. It's not, nobody's 100% certain, but something like this. So it always was a goddess in Irish mythology. The Book of Armagh describes, where's the Book of Armagh, down there. The Book of Armagh describes St. Patrick crossing the Shannon, and again referring to the river as a goddess, the Shannon as a goddess. Shannon is described as radiant, ever generous, strong, gentle lady of noble repute, sweet-voiced, red-lipped and maiden. She has a personality in Irish mythology. She's got a character and descriptions of her. Her story is that she wanted to go to this well, Conla's well. Conla is the druid who sort of controlled the well or owned the well. And the hazelnuts around the well, the hazel trees would form nuts and they would fall into the river. And when they fall into the river, the salmon eat them, giving the salmon this wisdom that gives the salmon of knowledge, this stuff. But she was basically cautioned not to go there without the right context, without the right expertise, without Conla, without the druid. And she did anyway. And unfortunately then she drowned because she had not got the right context and the right expertise. The message is that, she was spellbound by the bubbles and so on of the river. I think somebody describes it as, the upshot is, the moral of the story is, absolute knowledge was believed to be perilous when not handled correctly in the right hands. A little knowledge is a dangerous thing, is the moral of the story. This person is Maud Joint. She's a Celtic scholar and linguist. She was born in Bealnamulla, again, right here in Athlone. And she studied precisely this, Shannon. She studied exactly this. She studied in various parts of Europe, including in Liverpool, where I was at one point. She was actually originally Methodist, but she switched over to actually being no church, and she became a vegetarian, actually a Buddhist and a feminist. She considered herself a real paddy, as she described, or somebody described her. And she describes all this stuff, and that's her interpretation of this. So again, I'm pointing out that we had the expertise right here in Athlone, all this stuff, which she's forgotten as well, of course. There she is, Shannon and her friends. You recognise some of our people there. So the point is, she inspired lots of things, and other goddesses of our rivers have inspired lots of stuff. So that's the story of Shannon. And now I give you the story of the other side. Actually, the council did instruct us today, give both sides of the story. Here is the other side of the story. The Mask of the Shannon. Now, a letter from the council said that this decision to select this piece was something to do with artistic storytelling. Storytelling, mind you. What story can I tell? I can't tell you any myth. There is no myth to do with this. All I can give you is the history of this piece. So, by the way, in the Westmeath last week, somebody said, I believe this work of art, which is in conversation with the not-so-distant past, this is also just as authentic as something of the distant past, somebody said. I think actually Caroline put in a letter to rebuke that, but it didn't quite work yet. Anyway, this is the history. It comes from the Custom House in Dublin. There it is. On the Custom House is the Crown of England, perched superior to the Harp of Ireland, which is Brian Boru's harp. So that's Ireland's inferiority to the Crown of England, there. We have 14 river deities, river gods, pieces like this, one of which is the Shannon. They're all named except one, the Liffey. And the reason why the Liffey is female is because people thought it was Anna Liffia, and that was even wrong as well. That was from On Liffey, which means the Liffey in Irish, but they thought the On means Anna, so they thought, okay. So it was a mistake, compounded on a mistake, gives you something that's sort of right. Anyway, the idea came from this chap, John Beresford, the first tax collector of Ireland. There he is. The architect was James Gandon, he's one of these guys here. It came around the time of Ossian. The idea comes from Somerset House in London, and it was all around the time of where this neoclassicism was in vogue. Viola Barrow in the 40s described this as, the Shannon one is supposed to indicate the wealth of the river around Limerick. Limerick, not Athlone, Limerick. The idea was that this was the rivers were pulling the wealth from various parts of the country, sending them to Dublin, and then to the British Empire. So there's the Custom House. The people who designed it were people, these quotes are not from me, these are from actually this programme, A Life of James Gandon, which I listened to carefully and wrote down the quotes. Their world was one of privileged nobility. Beneath them lived an impoverished underclass. So personally, I identify myself more with this second one. Beresford said they should be kept down by a policy of unyielding repression. So that's the guys who built this thing. Napper Tandy, you might know, he was one of the United Irishmen, as was our friend there, Richard Carwin, earlier. He protested against the construction of this, and but anyway, Beresford laughed, or I said, instructed Gandon, the architect, to carry on regardless, and laugh at the folly of the people. Does that echo anything? There's the Custom House. This is where Gandon lived. In this place, I think it's been renamed now actually, but anyway, that's where he lived. There's lots of Beresford streets and stuff like that around this area still. Sorry? Dublin 7, okay. So it's there, that's where he lived, right by the Monto. Have you heard about the Monto? Maybe in the old Dublin or something? The Monto was the red light district. That's where people, these impoverished underclass, resorted to prostitution to feed their children and to pay the rent. So it was even abusing that, taking advantage of that thing. In the 1798, the United Irish Rebellion, Gandon fled to London. He was under threat by the United Irish movement, of course. So that's basically the history of the thing. The call for this piece that's going up was an innovative piece of art which addresses Athlone town's urban context. This is what they're asking for in this piece. The location of the artwork close to the River Shannon and the old railway line, as well as the heritage, as well as, but as well as the heritage, memory and environment of the town. So there you have it. That's proposals should be uniquely of the town as well. The process, they said was, of course, it's subjective. There's some subjective process in assessing the quality of these submissions that they had. So that brings me to, because the council are saying continuously that process is process, they adhere to the correct process, the correct procedures, and there's nothing they can do. They can't go back because they did the right thing all along. Sorry, it's my reminder to put out the pin. Sorry. There's no can't dismiss now. Rightio. So how about panels, or how panels make judgments? Well, as it happens, this is something we did as well, because it's something to do with networks. The panel is networked. 90% of all scientists that ever lived actually are alive today, which means that they have lots of data that we can do statistics on. The question is, how do we judge scientific work? How do we judge artistic work? How do panels of experts work? There's a chap down the road from where we are, Robert Mackay, a very famous mathematician, and he invented something which involved us in. This is a process inside Coventry University, reached by 2015, where again there was a panel, and they were selecting. People were allowed to, academics were put in grant proposals, like artists put in proposals for sculptures. There was a panel formed. There were 11 assessors on the panel, 44 bids. In Athlone there was, I think, 5 assessors on the panel and there was 8 bids or something like that. Obviously everybody can't be expert on everything, so what they do is they basically take averages, and of the 44 bids, some were successful. These are the yellow ones are basically the successful ones. So for example, this means object number 41 was the most successful one. It got a score of 87% and so on. However, the flaws of such processes of simply taking the averages of the various assessors is that there's no calibration. How do you calibrate the expertise of these people? And that's what my friend down the road from me in Coventry, in Warwick University, he'd invented this beautiful mathematical algorithm relatively recently. We call it Calibrate with Confidence, where we can sort this sort of stuff out. And you can see, these are, I didn't want to give the names of the people who were on the panel, so instead I gave them anonymous characteristics like these, but it sort of reflects their characters because I know them in Coventry University. And Sleepy, for example, who was an assessor, gave an average score of 84% to the things that Sleepy assessed, and Meanie gave an average score, you know who Meanie is, of 49.1%. So you can see, if you are lucky, and these two, if you are lucky, you might be assessed by these people, or these people might campaign vigorously for your piece that you submit. You might get lucky, or you might be unlucky and be assessed by these people. So panels, just because a panel is a panel, it doesn't mean that they do the right thing. This algorithm corrects that. It's mathematical stuff. When we put our algorithm through this process, quite a different landscape emerges. The yellow ones are the ones that are successful in the old process of panels where they're not calibrated, and the blue ones are the ones that should have been successful if they were correctly calibrated. Okay, so the point about it is, just because there is process, it does not mean that the process is the right process. It's not calibrated. The right expertise is not to hand. Anyway, so in fact, the manager in Athlone said to me, I certainly am not an expert. She was in that panel because for health and safety reasons. That was her expertise, not iconography. If it happened again, this whole thing would be much more widely circulated. So my point is, the lack of expertise gives the wrong information, gives the wrong interactions, and the whole entire thing about networks is about interactions, just like these atoms are interacting and the people are interacting. So it's all connected. As I said, the reverse angle of the maquette may not be easily visible. They confess that. Somebody said, I like this quote, I actually voted for the winner, but I made that decision based on information provided by the council. I didn't know any better at the time. I took it at face value. I made my choice based on incorrect information. A bit like Brexit. But it's never too late to put things right. That person said on Facebook. So this is what happened. After now we give the people information. And now what happens when the people have the information? This is, I think, my first letter in the Westmeath, and then lots of things happened. So people, I was then on radio and reached the right people who were able to spread the word to further people in the network that is our community, because the information, people embrace the information. And there's Fiona, for example, talking about it, and the petition was formed, which is nearly 600 signatures, if not 600 now, I don't know. There is Caroline organised an event in Athlone, more letters in the newspaper, more events organised here locally, where people are using their maths books and their myths books to say that we value knowledge, we want to be informed about what's going on. More activities in Athlone, something in the newspaper in England, for the Irish community, the diaspora actually, that's my favourite newspaper actually, that's why I'm sort of in contact with them. There was a quiz even, how well do you know Ireland statues? A quiz formed. National Focus, when there was something on the national. And I think T.G. Cahir covered it recently, and so on and so forth. So you can see lots of interest. I recently was in Armenia, as I said, where I gave a talk, amongst other things, about this sort of stuff. I'll refer back to that shortly. Now let's go back to the original question. And who am I in this whole process? What is my role in all of this? I am not Leo to the council's Boris. So, because this is not about politics at all. So I'm not, Leo, remember what he said to Boris, he was trying to advise him to do the right thing. I'm trying to advise to do the right thing, but I'm not Leo to Boris because it's not politics. I am not Athena to the council's Hercules, because I don't want to knock anybody out, and I don't want to hurt anybody, and I don't want anybody to be embarrassed by this at an individual level or any level. I'm not Shannon, because as when I spoke to the councillors in the first stage of this, the councillor said, but you are not a woman. Because I am not a woman, I cannot argue that this is a misappropriation of gender by switching from a goddess to a god. That was the invalidation of my point. So I'm undermined because I'm not her. At best, I can be like Kenna. Remember, Kenna was the one who said, don't go near the well. Don't do it without the right knowledge. And that's my role. I'm saying, do not make this decision without having the right expertise to hand. That's my role in this. So now the question is, who are you after you have the information? And who are you going to be identified as in years to come? Well, I don't know if you've got a choice. But frankly, today we went to the council and they said, they were a little bit nervous about me going on radio and things like that, and they didn't want to go on radio or anything. They said that I should not misquote in any way or quote out of context, and the mayor wrote something down that we can use, and this is, so I'll give you his word. So following a meeting today with Orla, Donnelly and myself, then the councillors, they are happy with the piece. I'll read it now, you can see it. This is what I'm allowed to say. They are happy, the council is happy, with the piece as an appropriate art piece for the time. Not my words, the councillor's words. They invited Orla and Ralph to engage in the process for a planned new art piece pending announcement by the OPW, a new art piece for Athlone to represent the Shannon goddess. So we're suggesting another piece. But our point is, putting up an insult to our heritage, or putting up something good alongside something bad, does not negate the bad thing. So we didn't really react to that. So that's the decision of the council today was, that's it. They're not going back. They said there's a, what's the word they used? They're not returning. You might remember that quote. That's the end, or is it? Well, here it is. Somebody, recently a professor from, a physics professor from Spain was on tour in Ireland, and in Temple Bar in Dublin, he spotted this. In Temple Bar, you know, the famous pub in Dublin? That's where he spotted, and he sent me this picture. And he was pretty appalled by this. This is a picture of the Irish passport. You might recognise that. I've seen it around the place. Look at this little fella coming in here. So this is actually the old 50 euro, £50 note. I'm not sure what it was. But basically, this means it's when the council say it's finished here in Athlone, it's done, that they're not going back. But this now means it's not just about Athlone, it's a national thing. We haven't solicited any national coverage in the press at all to this point. But this opens up a new venue. The story is not over yet. When I was in Armenia, I just put one more last thing. When I was in Armenia, this is a statue in Armenia, in Yerevan, the capital of Armenia. This used to be Stalin. That's what this sort of represents, the might of that regime. That was Stalin. It was one time inconceivable that Stalin could be taken down as a statue, but he was taken down. That is now a woman. That's a statue of Armenia to represent Armenia. It's a woman, it's female. These are people in Armenia, this is my picture, I took this myself only 2 weeks ago. These are people in Armenia celebrating their heritage, their culture, and they're proud of themselves. So remember that quote by somebody on Facebook. They said, it's never too late to put things right. Maybe yet we might find a way. By the way, I just always thank the air ambulance. I know there's something going on in Athlone about air ambulance and stuff nowadays. I like air ambulance because they've saved my life once upon a time. So that's it. Thank you very much for your attention.